Today's topic is Pearson International A-Levels. Now this exam, which is held 3 times a year, is it an opportunity for us or a trap? Let's take some time to find out about this. What's important is not how many times you take the test, but rather your test-taking strategy. Let's go over the details one by one. Now, the International A-Levels are held 3 times a year. On the other hand, the GCE A-Levels held in the UK take place once a year. So, International A-Levels are offered in January, May, June or October, while the GCE A-Levels, which students studying in the UK take, are held once in May, June. This is actually the key point. So you can take the exam multiple times. But does that mean you should interpret it as needing to take the exam several times? Absolutely not. Having more opportunities to take the exam doesn't mean you should just take it without proper preparation. Of course, from the exam board's perspective, it's not a bad thing since you pay the exam fees. But what's important is you yourselves, right? Now, students studying A-Levels in the UK usually attend 6th form colleges. After studying for 2 years, they take the exam all at once at the end of those 2 years. In other words, the course is long, but the assessment happens only at the very end. This is the original intention behind the A-Levels. It is essential that you fully grasp the underlying significance of this meaning. Now, shall we take a look at the International A-Levels? There are no separate exam regulations. That is, there are no rules like you must take the exam only in January or only in June or only in October. But does that mean you can just take the exam whenever you want? A lack of regulations means you need a strategy. In other words, although there are no specific rules for taking the exam, you need to understand why that is. Usually, formal educational institutions that teach you have their own structured operating rules and specific guidelines. However, students who undertake the challenge of preparing for their studies independently are not bound by these institutional regulations. So they must take full responsibility for creating and following their own comprehensive, personalized study plans. That difference ultimately leads to significant results. International A-Level, abbreviated as IAL. Now it's a modular system. In other words, to complete one subject, you have Unit 1, 2 and 3, which make up the AS, and then 4, 5 and 6, which make up the A2. AS and A2 are combined to form a single subject. These subjects apply to math and science. For the social science track, there are 4 units. And for vocational related subjects, there are sometimes only 2 units. Once you take these units, your records are permanently kept. If you retake the test for each unit, only the units with higher scores will continue to be updated. Whether this works to your advantage or disadvantage depends on each individual case. Now this is the most ideal way to take the exam. You finish 12th grade and then take the AS exam. After finishing 13th grade, you take the A2 exam. If it's a 12-year system, you take the AS after 11th grade and the A2 after 12th grade. Taking the exams in this way is the standard path. In other words, before 2014, the UK's A-Level, the GCE A-Level, used to be modular, and it was structured like this. Therefore, following this standard is the best way to avoid any issues with universities later on. Of course, if you make good use of the system where the International A-Levels are held 3 times a year, it can be advantageous. For example, if you spread out your exams or if you slightly miss your desired grades and retake the exams to improve them, there are certainly benefits to be gained in those cases as well. However, because it's rare for students to navigate these crisis situations well on their own, I keep emphasizing this point. This is what we call retaking exams, and universities are of course aware that students can make mistakes when taking exams. But ultimately, this is just what universities say. It doesn't mean that all admissions processes treat such students in exactly the same way. Therefore, even if there is an opportunity to retake the exam, it's best not to do so if possible. Of course, if you find yourself in a situation where you absolutely must retake the exam, then you should go ahead and do it. However, preparing with the intention of retaking the exam is a very risky path. Because these are international A-levels, the reason the exams are divided into 3 parts is not to encourage you to keep taking the tests, but rather because of deadlines. There's a specific reason for splitting them up like this. For example, in the case of German universities, your grades need to be submitted by July 15th in order for you to be able to enroll in September or October. But since A-level results are announced in mid-August, you have to take a gap year. Of course, these days, it's common for people to take a gap year. However, for students who don't want to do that, they can use the results from the January exams to apply to countries like Germany, where you need to submit your documents early. If you've seen the advantages so far, now let's take a look at the disadvantages. If you use it incorrectly, your studies can fall apart. What does that mean? So, classes, exams, retakes, and then more exams. If you look at the characteristics of A-levels, you need to know the material in order to be able to use it. However, some students habitually just take exams. So, if you keep taking exams, will your grades really improve? Raising your score by 1 or 2 points doesn't mean anything. For it to be meaningful, your score needs to go up by 10, 20, 30, or even 50 points. But in most cases where students take exams out of habit, they end up just treading water. That's because they weren't prepared. Students often say, come on, but still, if I take the test this time, won't my score go up a bit? But this isn't something like the TOEFL or IELTS exam. If you're not prepared, even if you take the test 100 times, you can't get a good score. Yes, that's the perspective you need to have. Because the overall test pattern can be disrupted, you need to plan your strategy carefully. Now, retaking the test randomly, this is really the worst strategy. Trying to fix a low score can end up making your entire application less credible. What this means is, when you apply to universities, you submit your grades, right? Of course, 1 out of 100 or 1 out of 1,000 people might be able to deceive a university. But if you lose that trust even once, your entire application will be ruined. In other words, the university will stop evaluating your application altogether. In that case, you're the only one who loses out. These kinds of situations actually happen quite frequently. If you only took the test without any other preparation, then of course from the university's perspective, if it's a school that's desperate for even one more student, they might turn a blind eye. But if the university you're aiming for is a top-tier school, the story is completely different. As you can see, there are different possible scenarios. These possible scenarios arise when competition is fierce, and top-tier universities always have intense competition. That's why they have no choice but to look at your records, especially for UK medical schools or highly competitive majors in the UK, as well as top universities and top majors in places like Hong Kong or Singapore. They consider a wide range of possible scenarios. So if you get caught on even one small detail, it can put you at a significant disadvantage. Retaking the exam itself is not usually a disqualifying factor, although for some majors it can be. Generally, it's not a reason for disqualification, but in various scenarios, if I were in the same position, I could end up at a disadvantage. And for some universities or in certain countries, the story in your application documents could fall apart. In other words, when you apply to universities, you might submit your predicted scores or your current grades, but if these documents don't align with each other, your application can lose credibility with the university. If you lose credibility, no matter how good your grades are later, you've already been rejected, so universities rarely reverse their decisions. Therefore, it's extremely important not only to show your highest scores, but also to demonstrate the consistency and progression of your grades. Now, there's the October exam. You can think of the October exam as a chance for redemption. Of course, when I say chance for redemption, I'm talking about retaking the exam. It's possible that when you took the test in May or June, your condition was really not good. If, for example, you couldn't take the exam due to health issues or family problems, or if your mind was elsewhere and you couldn't properly take a particular unit, then that's not a true reflection of your actual ability. In such cases, retaking the exam for those reasons is generally not considered a big issue by universities. However, most students don't retake the exam for those reasons, but simply to improve their grades. And that's why it always becomes an issue in university admissions. As I mentioned earlier, the January and May exams are mainly for document submission deadlines. For example, if a German university requires you to submit documents by a certain deadline and the May or June exam dates don't fit your schedule, then it makes sense for your final exam to be in January. However, if all students are made to take the January exam, then the majority of students who are focused on the May and June exams will face problems as well. That's why in the end you have to go with the flow. Since the global pattern is based on the May and June schedule, if you change the system for a small minority, the majority and the system itself will collapse. So in this case, it's better to stick with the May and June schedule and just take a gap year instead. Universities are actually very supportive of gap years. They really welcome it. British universities, as well as some other countries, are very welcoming of gap years. So, planning your university path that way is actually safer. If the school system has final exams in January, then students should follow that schedule. But if the school system is based on May or June, then it's right to follow that timeline. It's difficult to set October as the final exam period. That's because some units aren't completed by then, so making October the final exam period is very risky. Therefore, the best way to show your top results to universities is to take the S exams after finishing year 12 and the A2 exams after finishing year 13. In the 12-year system, you take the AS exams after year 11 and the A2 exams after year 12. Of course, some retakes can be considered exceptions. The fact that international A-levels are held 3 times a year is, in the end, neither an advantage nor a disadvantage. If the school or the educational institution manages this system, it definitely becomes an opportunity for you. But if students themselves overuse it, it becomes a pitfall. The more I experience college admissions each year, the more I realize that universities prefer well-prepared students over those who simply take a lot of exams to boost their grades. You need to prepare with this most important point in mind. Even if you prepare for the same qualifications in the same way, you can end up with different results. The reason is that even if the opportunities are the same, the way you use them is different. The results differ because instead of preparing according to the proper method and true intention, you prepared in your own way. Although the exam is held 3 times a year, in January, May and October, it's absolutely not the case that you can just take the test whenever it's convenient for you and get into a good university with a good score. You have to use it according to the proper method. In any case, various universities are talking about this. If you look at the law school at UCL in the UK as an example, the A-levels must be taken in the same sitting. It clearly states that they must be completed all at once. If your grades are A, and A, but you took math last year and the others this year, it is clearly stated that this will not be accepted. And if you retake the exam, in the case of a resit, it is stated as a rule that it is simply not allowed. Now, shall we take a look at the University of Hong Kong? When you apply to the University of Hong Kong, there is a section where you have to indicate which attempt the exam is. Here, if it's your first attempt, you write first. If it's your second, second. If it's your fifth, fifth. You have to fill this in accordingly. Of course, you could try to cheat. If you cheat and the university is fooled, that might be lucky for you. But in any case, most universities look for honesty in their applicants. So if you slip up in this area, no matter how good your grades are, you'll be eliminated in the document screening stage. Of course, there is no rule that says you will be rejected just because you take the test multiple times. However, you never know when you might become the scapegoat. For example, NTU in Singapore clearly specifies that A2 results must be from the same sitting. Of course, due to Singapore's unique circumstances, they require you to prepare 4 subjects. So, the requirement is to complete all 4 subjects in the same sitting. Now, let's look at the medical school requirements for Imperial College London. They specify a 1-sitting requirement. And it is clearly stated that if you resit the exam, it will not be recognized. The universities and departments I'm mentioning now are highly competitive and among the top tier, so you need to pay close attention to these details. Now let's look at some examples from our students. The text is a bit small, but to elaborate, this student consistently achieved A in all 5 subjects. They completed their AS in 2022 and then finished their A2 evenly in 2023. Some of you may ask how universities know if you retake exams. When you submit a transcript like this, it clearly states which year and when you took each exam. For example, if most units are from 2022 and 2023, but another unit is from 2024, universities can easily figure it out if they look into it. Generally, it's not an issue, but if a university does take issue with it, you would simply be disqualified. There have actually been such cases. Here is another student's case. Similarly, this student completed AS in 2023 and finished A2 in 2024, resulting in a final grade of 4 A stars and 1 A. Universities have no grounds to object to this because these are perfect grades. It's a result that hits the mark in one go. The reason we keep emphasizing this is that when students prepare for university, they are essentially staking their lives on getting into these schools from their respective positions. That's why, after putting your life on the line to prepare for university, it would be heartbreaking if a single unit became a disqualifying factor and caused you to be rejected. Right? So, to make sure you don't give even the slightest reason for disqualification, we keep giving you these explanations. Exams are not something you pass by luck. You take them based on your own abilities. Especially with essay type exams like A-levels, remember that when you take the test only after you are fully prepared, that score will be the one that best showcases your abilities. Alright, that concludes today's explanation. Thank you.